Chapter 13, How Populations Evolve. Life on Earth, as hopefully you know, is wonderfully diverse. There's over 1.3 million species that have been identified on planet Earth. However, that's just a small piece of the pie. There's estimates of millions more species that are yet unknown. And I've read estimates anywhere from 50 to 100 million species alive on Earth today. Most of them are actually unknown then. One reason is many of them are found in places that we don't have easy access to, like the deep ocean, or they're simply microscopic microbes, like bacteria, species that we simply have not yet identified. So there's a lot to still know about life on Earth. So the process of evolution has generated the incredible amount of diversity that we find on Earth today. And what we see here on the right is what we call sometimes the tree of life, with the origin at the base, and it's analogous to a tree growing where the trunk, the bottom of the ground, where it hits the ground will be the origin of life, the base of life on Earth, and then all the branches leading to specific groups of living organisms, and the actual organisms that are either alive today or went extinct are the ends of the branches, which are analogous to like leaves at the end of a huge tree. So humans have a history of naming, describing, and classifying organisms, because humans tend to be curious by nature, and we like to categorize things and name things and put things in boxes in a way. So taxonomy is the branch of biology dealing with identifying, naming, and classification or classifying organisms or species. The Linnaean system is the current system that we use to identify, name, and classify organisms, named after Carolus Linnaeus, an 18th century biologist in Europe. So this method of naming species was established by Carolus Linnaeus, as we'll talk about further, and it organizes organism species into a hierarchical classification of species into broader and broader groups that are larger and larger and larger. And we'll talk about this as we proceed here. So Linnaeus is considered the father of taxonomy. So this system, this Linnaean system, each species, once identified, is given a two-part Latinized name or a binomial name. Bi meaning two. So in the example here, our large wild kitty cat, the panther, fits into a hierarchical classification system. And the first part of its name is the genus. First part of the binomial name for this organism is the genus, which includes a group of closely related species, as we see here, genus. And the genus for this organism, its name, is Panthera. Notice that it's capitalized and written in italics. The second part is the species name, and that's within a genus. And for this panther, its species name is Pardus. Notice that it's lowercase, and the binomial nomenclature, the genus and species name are always written together. And then notice species here, Panthera pardus. And once you get to the binomial nomenclature, the binomial name, we're talking about that specific species and none other. So this Linnaean system for grouping species into a hierarchy of categories, as we see, the species are grouped into genera, which is plural for genus. Then the genera, closely related organisms, are grouped into a larger taxonomic group called family. So Felidae referring to the cats. Families are grouped into an order class or larger grouping called order. Notice that carnivora is going to include all the carnivorous organisms. and only some of those are the cats. Okay? So these groupings, these levels, are called taxons. The orders are put into classes. Where's my cursor? Here we go. So the bigger class now is Mammalia, all of the animals, and only some of them are carnivores. Okay. Then bigger than class is Phyla, which again is plural for phylum. So the Chordata, all of the chordate animals. And larger than phylum now are the kingdoms. So the kingdom Animalia, all of the animals. And then even larger than the kingdom, as we talked about before, are the domains. And currently there are 3 domains on Earth: bacteria, eukarya, and archaea. So this is the taxonomic groups for classifying organisms from the biggest, broadest, meaning domain, there's only 3 domains on Earth, to the smallest, narrowest species taxon. That specific organism, the Panthera pardus. So explaining this incredible diversity on life, the explanation for the origin of this diversity was proposed by Charles Darwin with his concept of evolutionary theory, and he published this groundbreaking work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, as we'll talk about, back in 1859. And this is Charles Darwin as an older man. So a little bit on some thoughts prior to Darwin. So Aristotle, Greek philosopher, generally held the view that species are fixed, unchanging, permanent forms that do not change over time. And that view was held for a long time. The Judeo-Christian culture reinforced this with literal interpretation of the Genesis, which tells that each of the life forms being created in its current present-day form. Again, reinforcing the fact that, the belief that species are fixed and are not changing. In the 1600s, religious scholars estimated also that the Earth was relatively young, only about 6,000 years old. So these thoughts were prevalent for a fairly long amount of time. But naturalists and early biologists had problems. For example, how do they interpret fossils? They were finding fossils of organisms that were not found on Earth today, so they had trouble explaining what these things were. So for example, here's a fossil of an organism in the ocean that is most closely related to things like squids and octopuses today, but it is this coiled structure that they did not have any idea what it was. They referred to it as a snake stone, coiled up snake that died in that position. However, they never found the snake's head attached to it. That's because this is the coiled shell of the animal, and the soft-bodied part of the animal didn't fossilize easily. We'll talk about stuff like that as we go through this chapter. So for example, these snake stones, they were thought to be the coiled bodies of snakes, but they never found the head associated with the snake. So fossils were a bit puzzling. And naturalists and biologists thought, well, maybe these things represent species that had ceased to exist, that became extinct. So these newer thoughts of naturalists and biologists came into contradiction with some of the previous held ideas that species were fixed and non-changing over time. The evidence started to mount that maybe that's not necessarily the case. Especially when they started finding things like this. It's like, okay, we don't find this in our backyard. How do we explain these sorts of things? So by the early 1800s, more and more fossils were found, especially things like of dinosaurs. And this example here is a reptile, which actually is a dinosaur, and it's called the ichthyosaur, meaning fish lizard, and convinced many naturalists, biologists that extinctions must have occurred because these organisms are no longer found on Earth today. So naturalists compared fossils with living species and noticed certain patterns and similarities and differences. So for example, here's a skeleton of a giraffe, very long-necked, legged animal, and it has certain similarities to fossils of animals that appeared to be giraffe-like, except the modern living giraffe was a modification of this older organism. Just like here we have a modern horse, and they were finding more and more fossils that seemed to be horse-like, but yet different, and more different with the ones that appeared older. So a French naturalist biologist, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, early 1800s, came up with the explanation that these observations of these fossils can be explained by the fact that life does change or evolve over time. So Lamarck was one of the earliest naturalists to propose the concept of organisms changing, species changing over time, and that's what we call evolution. So Lamarck proposed that through evolution, that organisms changed or refined their physical characteristics, their traits that allow organisms to perform successfully, to survive and live, and pass those traits on to their organisms by their adaptations or by their changes to the environment. So Lamarck's explanation for the long neck in a giraffe was that ancestral giraffes in the past had to reach and stretch to obtain food, leaves on tall trees, and in doing so would stretch their necks during that giraffe's lifespan. So that slightly longer neck was passed on to the giraffe's offspring, their babies, and they had slightly longer necks, just a little bit, to successfully survive in their environment. And then those giraffes, when they reproduced, their offspring had slightly longer necks. So these refinements, these changes in their traits, accumulated over the generations, and we get what we have today, a very long-necked giraffe. So individuals can develop certain traits, and they pass those on to their offspring. That was Lamarck's explanation for why we have this long-necked giraffe, when apparently, according to the fossil record, its ancestors were not that long-necked. So Lamarck's idea of how species evolve was mistaken. That is incorrect. That's not how organisms evolve. We'll talk about how they evolve as we get through this chapter and the next one. But his idea that species do change over time, that they evolve over time in response to their environments, that was correct. So Lamarck was one of the first people to correctly propose that organisms do change, evolve over time. However, how they change, the mechanism of the change, was incorrect. We move on to Charles Darwin, who proposed a correct explanation. So, a little on his history. 1809 to 1892. Charles, as a boy, was fascinated by nature, collected insects, other organisms, and studied them. He wanted to go to med school, or he was encouraged to go to med school by his family. He did quit med school and studied to be a clergyman back at Cambridge University in England. But by the age of 22, he decided to become the naturalist on board the ship, the HMS Beagle, which was looking for a naturalist and was heading out for a 5-year research voyage. This is young Charles Darwin here. So the Beagle charted the South American coast and other places, but spent much time in South America, and in particular the Galapagos Islands, which you may have heard about. Leaving Great Britain, 1831, basically a voyage around the world, got back 5 years later. So he spent much time on the shore exploring nature, a lot of time on the land in South America, and again the Galapagos, and collected thousands of plants and animals. We'll continue the next part.